So there's some ethical considerations we must consider when talking about negotiations. Welcome back. We're moving on to chapter 5. In chapter 5, we're going to talk about ethics in negotiations. So let's get started. I'll share my screen, my monitor. Excuse me. So this is chapter 5 from the book Negotiations, and it's from McGraw-Hill Education, the publisher. So we're still dealing with negotiation fundamentals, and this is chapter 5 of that. So ethical quandaries. People in and out of organizations confront decisions about strategies to use to achieve important objectives. These decisions often carry ethical implications. Consider these questions when working through the ethical issues what ethical issues may arise during negotiation. So, what are ethics and why do they apply to negotiations? What approaches to ethical reasoning are relevant to negotiation? What questions of ethical conduct are likely to arise in negotiations? And what motivates unethical behavior? What are the consequences? And what shapes a negotiator's predisposition to use unethical tactics? And how can negotiators deal with the other party's use of deception? So, ethics in negotiations. Again, ethics are broadly applied social standards for what is right or wrong in a situation or a process for setting those standards. The four standards for evaluating strategies and tactics are choosing a course of action on the basis of results I expect to achieve. End result ethics evaluates the pros and cons of our actions' consequences. On the basis of my duty to uphold appropriate rules and principles, duty ethics is an obligation to adhere to the consistent principles. On the basis of norms, values, and strategy of community, social contract ethics is based on customs and norms. And choose a course of actions on the basis of my personal convictions. Personalistic ethics is based on the conscience and moral standards. So applying ethical reasonings and reasoning to negotiations, we do that earlier in a person selling an e-bike tells a buyer and a second potential buyer, then that when there is not a buyer. If you believe in end results ethics, you would lie to get the best outcome. If you believe in duty ethics, you might reject a tactic requiring a lie. If you believe in social contract ethics, if others lie, you will too. And if you believe in personalistic ethics, your conscience decides. So we have end result ethics, duty ethics, social contract ethics, and personalistic ethics. This shows your approach to ethical reasoning affects your ethical judgment and the behavior you choose. Ethics versus prudence or practicality versus legality. Ethical is appropriate as determined by some standard or moral conduct. Prudent is wise based on trying to understand the efficiency of the tactic and the consequences it may have on the relationship with the other. Practical is what a negotiator can actually make happen in a given situation. Legal is what the law draws as acceptable practical. Other criteria include intrinsic and instrumental reasoning. Some tactics are seen by all as unethical. So, analytical process for the resolution of moral problems. First, we must understand all moral standards and recognize all moral impacts. Benefits to some, harms to others, rights exercised, rights denied. Define the moral problem. Determine the ethical outcomes, consider the legal requirements, evaluate ethical duties, and propose convincing and moral solutions. End result ethics. Negotiators with noble objectives feel they can use any tactics, that's end results, to get the end result that they want. Drawing on consequentialism, a view that the moral worth of an action should be judged on the basis of the consequences it produces. Followers of utilitarianism believe the best moral choice maximizes the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And I know we've all heard that one before. Debate about end result ethics centers on some key questions. How do people define maximum utility? And how is it measured? How do parties trade off between short-term and long-term consequences when one may damage the other? If unable to create utility for everyone, it is adequate to create it. It is then adequate to create it for many, even if some people will not benefit or will suffer. How do you balance the benefits of a majority with protection of the rights of the minority? How do you? Duty ethics. Duty ethics emphasizes that individuals should commit a series of moral standards and use those to make decisions. The term deontology is used to label this school of thought. Deontologists argue utilitarian standards are flawed as outcomes may be too certain at the time of the decision. They also propose the ethical merits of any action should be linked more to the intentions of the person than to the outcomes of the act. They believe an action is wrong due to principle, not consequences. The deontology has its critics. Who sets the standards and chooses the principles and makes the rules? What are the rules that apply in all circumstances? So social contract ethics. Proponents hold, in this particular space, hold that the righteousness of an action is determined by the customs and social norms of a community. They argue that societies, organizations, and cultures determine what is ethically appropriate and acceptable for themselves, then indoctrinate the new members as they are socialized into the community. As applied to negotiation, social contract ethics should prescribe appropriate behaviors in terms of what people owe one another. Social contract ethics are not without problems, though. How do we decide what implicit rules should apply to a given relationships, particularly when the rules are not explicitly spelled out? And who makes these social rules and how are they evaluated and changed? So then we have personalistic ethics. A fourth standard of ethics holds that people sometimes consult their own conscience. As humans, we develop a personal conscience of right and wrong. As applied to negotiations, personalistic ethics maintains that everyone ought to decide for themselves what is right. Critics have a few arguments to this. They argue no one is pure and individual conscience is too narrow and limited as a standard to apply to a broader social context. Some critics argue that social institutions have declined in their roles as teachers of character and developers of conscience. In addition, personalistic ethics provides no mechanism for resolving disputes when they lead to conflicting views between individuals. So questions of ethical conduct in negotiations include, why do some negotiators use unethical tactics? The first answer, immoral, maybe too simplistic. People regard other people's unsavvy behavior as due to the personality and attribute their own behavior to factors in the social environment. Now, a negotiator might consider an opponent's use of an ethically questionable tactic as unprincipled. In contrast, if a negotiator uses the same tactic themselves, they tend to say they have a good reason for deviating from principles this one time. Ethically ambitious tactics and truth. Ethically ambitious tactics may or may not be improper, depending on an individual's ethical reasonings and circumstances. Focus here on what negotiators say rather than what they actually do. Questions about truth telling are clear, but not the answers. First, how do you define truth? Second, how do you find and classify deviations from the truth? Effective agreements depend on sharing accurate information, but negotiators want to disclose little about their positions. The dilemma of trust is that a negotiator who believes everything the other says can be manipulated by dishonesty. The dilemma of honesty is that a negotiator who tells the other party all the requirements will never do better than they walk away than their walk away point. Now, what ethically ambitious tactics are there? There are 6 clear categories of tactics: traditionally competitive bargaining, emotional manipulation, misrepresentation to the opponent's network, inappropriate information gathering, buffering. Judgments are subjective for any given tactic, and some will see its use as ethically wrong, and others will have little or no problem with it. Thus, tolerance leads to the use of such tactics. Here are some research findings on the link between thinking a tactic is acceptable and actually using that tactic. There is a positive relationship between an attitude toward the use of a specific tactic and the intention to use it. Using unethical tactics early in a negotiation leads to greater frequency of use, and many cause the other party to follow suit. Tactics used by frequency, by hiding your bottom line and exaggerating an opening offer or stalling for time and misrepresenting information. Hiding your bottom line improves negotiators' performance in a role play. Now, excuse me, are ethically ambitious tactics acceptable to use? Well, studies indicate there are tactically agreed on rules in negotiations. Some minor forms of untruths may be seen as ethically acceptable and within the rules. In contrast, outright deception is generally seen as outside the rules. The authors offer some caution. Statements are based on large groups of people and do not indicate or predict any individual negotiator's use of such tactics. Observations are based on what people said they would do rather than what they actually did. By reporting the results, the authors do not endorse the use of marginally ethical tactics. This is a Western view of negotiation and not true for other cultures. Let the buyer beware at all times. Then, deception by omission versus commission. The use of deceptive tactics can be active or passive. Negotiators use 2 forms of deception in misrepresenting a common value issue. Both parties seek the same outcome. Misrepresentation by omission, failing to disclose information that would benefit the other party. Again, misrepresentation by omission is failing to disclose information that would benefit the other party, whereas misrepresentation by commission is actually lying about the issue. A student role play involving the sale of a car with a defective transmission revealed the following insight. Students could lie by omission or commission. Far more students were willing to lie by omission. So here's a sample, figure 5.2 shows a sample model of deception in negotiation. And as we can see here, this is quite interesting. We started an influence situation, we identified the range of influence tactics, and then it comes up to intentions and motives for using deceptive tactics. We go back down and those blend into using deceptive tactics. If yes, selection and use deceptive tactics, and then the consequences of that, no, and the consequences for that as well. So motives for using deceptive tactics spelled out means the purpose of ethically ambitious tactics is to increase the negotiator's power in the bargaining environment. Information is a major source of leverage. It has power. The view assumes that information is accurate and truthful. Using tactics already discussed, the liar gains an advantage. A negotiator's motivation affects their tendency to use deception. They may use it to achieve their goals. They may use them to avoid being exploited. It could be individual differences or personality or culture. People may be more motivated to appear moral than to act morally. An individual's approach to ethics comes into play as well. So consequences of unethical conduct include effectiveness. Evidence points to the effectiveness of deceptive tactics in certain circumstances. Misrepresentation, risk representing interests on an issue that both parties want can induce concessions that lead to favorable outcomes. Reactions of others targets who discover the deception or typically angry. For reasons or for serious and personal deception, the relationship suffers. Now, this is under reactions of others. Now, reactions of self. When the other party suffers, a negotiator may feel discomfort. Negotiators in a simulated situation who lied tended to make larger concessions later in a negotiation to compensate. So they had a heart. Explanations and justifications. Here are some typical rationalizations. The tactic was unavoidable. The outcome, so the negotiator is not responsible. The tactic was harmless, according to the deceptive party. The tactic will help to avoid negative consequences. For who? The tactic will produce good consequences and altruistically motivated. They had it coming, or they deserve it, or I'm getting my due. They were going to do it anyway, so I will do it first. Anticipation. He started it, anticipation in the past tense. The tactic is fair or appropriate to this situation, more relativism. So factors shaping predisposition or pre-deception. Demographic factors include women tend to make more ethically rigorous judgments than men. Female negotiators are lied to more than male negotiators. Both men and women behave more ethically as they age. Older parties see buffering as more acceptable, deception less so. Professional orientation may increase or decrease acceptability. There are cultural differences in attitudes toward ambiguous tactics and personality differences. Your straightforwardness leads to greater concern for the other party. There are 4 other dimensions of personality that may predict the likelihood of using ethically ambitious tactics discussed in the text. So personality differences, competitiveness versus cooperativeness. Competitors are more likely to use buffering, misrepresentation, and other dishonest tactics than cooperators. Competitors versus cooperators. Pro-social individuals are more honest than selfish individuals. Empathy and perspective taking. So based on these two, those high in empathy reject lying or misrepresentation. The cognitive trait of perspective taking neither approves or disapproves. Machiavellism, this appears to be a predictor of unethical behavior or conduct. Locus of control, those high in internal control are likely to do what is right. So, moral development and personal values. 6 stages of moral development grouped into 3 levels. A pre-conventional level where the person is concerned with outcomes that meet their current needs, particularly rewards and punishment. Or 2, a conventional level where the person defines what is right on the basis of the immediate social situation, peer groups, and society norms. And then 3, a post-conventional level where the person defines what is right on the basis of some broader set of universal values and principles. The higher the stage a person achieves, the more complex their moral reasoning and the more ethical their decisions. So contextual influences on ethical conduct. Past experience, particularly failure, can increase the likelihood of attempting to use unethical tactics. Greater incentives influence the inclination to misrepresent. Negotiators are ambiguous tactics if the other party, negotiators will use ambiguous tactics if the other party is perceived to be vulnerable or powerful as a defense. 2 aspects of negotiators' relationships affect tendency. What the relationship has been like in the past and what the parties would like to be in the future. As long-term versus short-term impacts use of ambiguous tactics. A balance of power should lead to more ethical conduct than an imbalance of power. So contextual influence. The structure of the negotiation situation may alter the ethical negotiators, may alter the ethics negotiators bring to the table. Advances in technology have affected the way negotiators communicate. Deception is viewed differently when it occurs over email. Acting as an agent of another party often gives moral latitude to do whatever is necessary to maximize results. Negotiators may look to social norms for expected behavior. Norms are informal social rules, the do's and don'ts. Group and organization norms may legitimize inappropriate behavior, and pressure to obey authority is strong and can undermine integrity. So, dealing with others' use of deception, ask probing questions, praise questions, phrase questions in different ways, force the other party to lie or back off, test the other party, call the tactic, ignore the tactic, discuss any help the other party shift to more honest, discuss and help the other party shift to a more honest behavior, respond in kind. And that does it for chapter 5. And so I hope that you got a lot out of chapter 5 as we went through that. In chapter 5, we covered a lot of information there. Remember, the first step in developing a complete understanding to the moral problem at hand. This means grasping the various subjective moral standards in play among involved parties, including individual values and beliefs, as well as the social norms. It also means recognizing the mix of potential harm, benefit, and rights that are involved in a situation. With the problem fully defined, the path to convincing solutions travels through 3 modes of analysis: a determination of economic outcomes or the potential courses of action, a consideration of legal requirements that bear on the situation, and an assessment of ethical obligations to others involved parties regarding what is right, just, and fair. So that's it for chapter 5. I look forward to seeing you in Coffee and Conversation. Take care.